Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. We were just catching up on Thanksgiving before I started recording. So I hope everybody had a wonderful Thanksgiving and a good week off. And you didn't miss the class too much last week. I know it was hard to go through the week without but I hope you didn't miss it too much. And we're glad you're back this week to continue learning. So thanks for being here. We're going to go ahead and jump in. I'm going to put up the text on the screen for you, and I'll even make it a little bigger to make it a little easier to read, because that should be good. Everybody can see that nicely, I hope. Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. So welcome to Parashat Vayetze. That's our Torah reading this week. And we're going to look a little bit at the Or HaMeir. Don't have a ton of biographical information on Reb Zev Wolf of Zhitomir, but he was a part of the circle of the Maggid of Mezrich, as was most of the rabbis, other than the Eish Kodesh 2 weeks ago. Most of the rabbis we've looked at so far have been as well. He sometimes takes a little bit more of an elitist approach, that, you know, the Hasidim are a little higher and better than everybody else. You won't see that too much here, but in other of his writings you might see it. But let's go ahead and dive in on our parsha this week. If somebody wants to read, starting with the verse, but
okay, I'll start.
please.
At Jacob.
Yeah.
Okay. Excuse me. Jacob left Beersheba and went to Haran. He came to a place, Makom, and slept there, for the sun was setting.
Okay. Seems like a kind of straightforward couple verses, right? Yeah. Anything stand out from here? Any questions that you guys have? Okay. Okay. So why don't you read the next paragraph too, so we can kind of see where Reb Zev Wolf is going to go with it.
Okay. There is a hint here as to the reason why a smart person is compelled to go from thought to speech. Is it not good for a person to always be sitting in deep thought, thinking about the exaltedness and greatness of the Holy Blessing One? But there is value in going from thought to speech.
Excellent. So what's he kind of saying here? What's kind of the issue?
Well, he says it's good for a person to sit in deep thought, thinking about the goodness and greatness of God, but there's also value from thinking that into actually, I don't know, saying it, proclaiming it.
Good.
That's kind of what I'm getting.
But what about the dictum that you learn more by listening than by talking?
Yeah, I'm not sure he would necessarily disagree with that. I'm just not sure that's exactly where he's going. I think what he's trying to go for is, there's one level at which we think about things, and there's another at which we speak it. I don't know if necessarily we would disagree that, you know, you learn a lot by learning. I don't think that's the suggestion. I think he's trying to compare this thought and speech that's going on here, and the difference between them.
So is he saying that there's I gotta think of how to phrase that first.
Well, it just seems to me that I would carry it a step further, that it's not just speaking, but it's doing.
But what?
That
You broke up for a second.
It's not enough just to think about it, but you have to be involved. You have to do things.
Good. Yeah, he does kind of make that implication here that Should you be sitting and thinking and meditating about God? Yes. And he makes the implication here that that's not sufficient, but that there has to be something that comes out of that as well, some kind of, that there's a speech that comes in through it also. We'll kind of come back to that as kind in a larger sense as we go.
Well, I can't quote it, but that's basically what Martin Luther King was saying at one point, that the people who sinned the most were the good people who were silent, during the civil rights era. They may have had great thoughts about this being a terrible thing in Birmingham, Alabama, but if they didn't say anything or do anything about it, they were just as guilty, if not more, than others.
But there's something in between thinking and doing. And when you say things out loud, it helps you to clarify your thoughts and to see what other people think, and maybe it influences your action. I think speaking may be in between meditating and acting.
I also think that when you speak things like, okay, we talked about a couple times, that it's like the realm of God is like a mirror to earth. So what we do here gets done in earth and vice versa. So is it like speaking is also manifesting that as well into this physical plane? I don't know.
So you guys are kind of taking a couple steps ahead. So let's back up. I don't think you're wrong necessarily. But I want to kind of follow the track of thought, and then we can kind of circle back to where we're going from here. I think you guys are kind of on the right track. I think for the most part you're in the right place. It's just, let's follow his train of thought, and then we can come back and speculate from there. Does somebody want to take over from here? Going.
I'll be glad to read. Here, going from thought to speech makes and joins together God's name as explained in several places. But look at the interpretation of the verse. Jacob saw that there was produce in Egypt, Mitzrayim. The contents of words of speech is narrow straits, or Meitzarayim, straits for thought, a narrow and limiting of the vastness of thought. Jacob understood the parts of pleasure, which is hinted at in Shever, which means shattered, a breaking of the wholeness of thought into pieces of the 5 sounds of the mouth. There's pleasure in each of these in and of itself, and this causes it to go from thought to speech.
Okay. That's a mouthful and a thoughtful. So what's he saying here?
I have entirely no clue.
Somebody want to take a stab?
It might speak to what Suzanne was saying, adding a little bit more broadness to her comments about the place between thought and action isn't just speech. It's there are different pieces of it. It says that there may be 5 steps between thought and action. There's 5 steps in speech is what I'm seeing here.
Well, and if you have a huge project to do or a huge thought that you want to convey, sometimes it's so huge you don't know how to just begin to say it. And so the way to begin is to start breaking it down into smaller pieces and connecting the pieces together, and eventually it comes out to be a whole thought, something like that.
So I actually think he's saying something a little different, I think. So what is the scope of things that we think about? right?
Can be very broad.
Right. It's broad, it's vast, it's an expanse. The way our brains work, there's a lot of things that go on in our brains and a lot of thought that can happen, sometimes simultaneously. If you sometimes feel like you're jumping from one thing to the next, and there's kind of a stream of consciousness that goes on in your brain. But not all of it goes into words. And I don't know if you've had this experience. I have this almost daily with my children, is that they'll be saying something. I'm like, what are you thinking? Or they like, let me show you something. Like, can you tell me instead of show me? They're like, I don't know how to say it. Right? If you had that feel where you're like, you're thinking something like, but I don't know how to put it into words.
Yeah. And also everything you think up here should not come out of here.
Absolutely. But there's what he's kind of saying is there's a vastness of thought that goes through the narrow straits into what we actually say.
Mm.
And there's kind of this transition that goes down into it. And you really can't say everything that you're thinking, not just because you shouldn't, as Tammy said, which is true also, but there's just a way that you can't express in words every thought that you have. There are thoughts that you have and you feel them and you sense them, you just can't quite put them into words. When you are able to go from transition from thought to speech, in some sense, there should be a little bit of pride that happens every time you do that, because you recognize not everything is able to make that transition. And how do you find the right words to say the thoughts that are in your mind? Now, the 5 sounds, by the way, that he mentions here, I don't think he's trying to break it up into pieces. I think what he's trying to say is more of the different kinds of sounds that your mouth can make. And I think the idea, I don't know, I'm not enough of a linguist to know if this is true or not, but I think the idea is that there are basic sounds and that everything else is a derivative of those sounds. So I know enough to know there's plosives, which are like the b, those sounds that kind of come out. There's gutturals, which are like the ch and and the stops. There's another one for like vowels that kind of don't stop. You can go ah.
Mm-hmm.
These are the different kinds of sounds that he's referring to. The 5 sounds of the mouth. That there's different sounds that your mouth makes that work together to form words. But to do that, you have to break up your thought into the pieces to be able to express them into those words to be able to make sound.
Which is to say, it's good sometimes to go from the vastness of thought through the narrowness into speech.
Yes.
But I'm confused I'm confused in the connection between the beginning passage and getting here. Like the second part seems fine, but I'm not sure how it's connected to the first part.
So he kind of says it at this beginning of this second paragraph, and he doesn't really cite his source here, so I'm not really sure where he gets it from. But there's a sense that this transition is, in a sense, piecing together God's name. And where I kind of take it from that, and I think before I say that, I think where you can go is, if you think of God's name, Yod He Vav He, there are parts of it that are abstract. Hey, just kind of, it's like a breath. It's not really a distinct sound in and of itself, but transitioning it into y, v, w is that transition from a to a va, ya, trying to turn this abstract into a sound, in using God's name to do that. Rabbi Art Green makes the point that, it's funny that he makes this transition and points it to God's name, which we don't even pronounce in the first place. But he uses that as kind of his model of transitioning from thought to speech. But there's a way in which, and I think we might come back to this a little bit, but there's a way in which this transition from thought to speech is bringing God's name together. We'll kind of circle back to that a little bit as we wrap up at the end.
So I guess what I was trying to say, maybe, and I appreciated that, was I'm not sure how he got to from the first two lines to saying, what's the hint here? He's saying, we read the first bit and then he said, there's a hint here. And then he went into something that seemed like it was talking about a completely different passage.
Are you meaning that first verse, Joshua?
Yeah. So what is the hint?
We haven't gotten to the hint yet.
Okay. So he's telling us where we're going.
Kind of building up. He's saying,
okay.
He's using this verse from Genesis in terms of style, and in terms of his style and his midrash and what he's doing here. What he's doing is he's saying, okay, so there's a hint here of going from thought to speech, and there's a way that we do that brings God's name together. And he kind of says in a way that we all know this. Yeah, we've talked about it enough times. We all know this. Not that we know this, but his people know this. And now he's saying, okay, now let's build on this for a moment. So he skips over to this verse from Genesis, which uses shever as produce and mitzrayim. We've seen this midrash on mitzrayim before. That means metzer yam, like the narrow straits. It pops up all the time in different midrashim, including Hasidic drashot, where they're going to read Mitzrayim as kind of a narrow strait, or as a narrow place that you have to go through the narrow to be able to get to where you're going. Where he's going here is that, okay, so this verse, Genesis 42:1, shows us this transition, because thought is expansive, and it has to go through the narrowness of language, and sometimes has to get broken up into pieces. You can't tell the exact full thought. It has to get broken up into pieces, shever, in order to be able to be expressed. We haven't actually tied it back to the verse yet. That's going to be the next step. Is he's kind of laying the groundwork of proving and showing his idea, and then this is kind of how a lot of these Hasidic drashot work, is they'll kind of come up with a question or an idea, they'll kind of build the foundation and show what they're saying is true, and then they'll say, okay, now this is how it ties back to the verse that we started with. So we just haven't gotten to that last step yet. Other questions, comments, thoughts so far? Well, since we're pondering that, let's come back. Let's bring it back to the verse now. If somebody wants to read it.
I'll read that. This is hinted at here. Jacob went out from Beersheba, which is wisdom and understanding, which is called Beersheba, as it is written, because Moses was willing to explain the Torah. As it is mentioned in the Zohar, he went from thought to speech, which is Haran. For Haran in Gematria is equivalent to throat, from which speech of Torah and prayer go out. This, he came, is a reference to prayer, to a place, to the holy blessing one, who is called the place of the world.
Okay, that's entirely clear now, right?
Right. So it looks like, which it always looks like, is if you don't understand or read Hebrew, you're not going to understand the references.
Well, that's he does do a lot of word plays here
Mhm.
in the Hebrew. So let's let's back it up and go piece by piece. Cindy, do you have something?
Yeah, because, well, he keeps saying here something about the place. And in the first paragraph, when they use the word hamakom, I think that's an important tie into what's here, because I think I've learned before that the term hamakom is a multifaceted word.
Good. Yes, it is. And let's start at the top and we'll work our way through the argument and end with that part with hamakom. But you're right, yes. So now this concept of thought to speech is going to go through the verse. So Jacob went out from Beersheba. Beersheba, bear is being used here. What does Beersheba mean? Let's start with that.
You mean literally, like it's a place?
It's literally a place, but what
Yeah.
does it translate as?
Oh, I just read that because of the whales. Oh, I
Well,
can't
you just said
remember.
it. It's
Oh, okay.
7 wells.
7 wells? Okay.
so it's a little vague. The Torah is a little awkward on it because it comes up in 2 different spots. It explains this place was called Beersheba. Sheva can mean 7, and that's the first interpretation. If I remember correctly, it's the first interpretation is that Abraham digs 7 wells and calls it Beersheba, 7 wells. Be'er means 7, means well. Sheva means well. Let me try that again. Be'er means well. Sheva means 7. There we go. Again, this transition of thought to speech is a really difficult one. So, the city comes up in a second place, I believe, with Isaac, in which there's a vow that's taken, and Sheva can also mean like an oath. It's punctuated, it's spelled the same but punctuated differently, so it becomes the well of the oath. Sheva here is really not the one that's being interpreted on, it's bear, well, that's being interpreted. So he says, Beer Sheva, the city is called, it represents wisdom and understanding. Why does it represent wisdom and understanding? Because this verse in Deuteronomy says that Moses was willing to explain the Torah, and it uses the same word, be'er, that means well, is also kind of used as to explain or to interpret in Deuteronomy. So it's the well of Torah that is being distributed out. So if you read that as Moses was willing to share the well of Torah, then how did Moses have it? Moses had wisdom and understanding to be able to explain Torah to everybody else. Everybody follow that train of thought?
Yes.
He says this is mentioned in the Zohar. The text I was working from gives a Zohar citation of it. I looked all over that page of the Zohar and could not find anything related to this. So I really am not sure what to do. It just occurs to me now that there may have been another way I could have looked it up in the Zohar, but I didn't think about it until right now, so I apologize. But I was going to try to give you the Zohar citation and we could look at it together. I just couldn't find it. So, all right. So Jacob went out from Beersheba. He went out from wisdom and understanding and went to speech, which is Haran. How is Haran speech? Do you guys know Gematria? Do you know what that is?
Is that where well, let me make sure I know what it is. Is that where the numbers equal
The letters
something?
equal numbers.
Right.
Okay.
Every letter of the Hebrew alphabet also represents a number.
Okay, that's what
So
I was
if you
trying to say.
actually look, I even have some right here where it's right here. It's C, Chelek Aleph, with like chapter 1, Kuf Mem Zion Bet. So Kuf Mem Zion is, Kuf is 100, Mem is 40, Zion is 7, so it's 147. So Haran has the same, if you put together the numbers for Haran, right here, here it is, Haran in the Hebrew, Chet is 8, Resh is 100, no, sorry, Resh is 200, Nun is 50, that comes up to
258.
good. Did I do the math wrong? Hold on. And Garon, 3 plus 200 plus 6 plus 50, you end up with the same number. So they do equal each other out. I don't know why I put 259 because it doesn't sound right. 3. I think I did the math wrong somewhere, but you guys got the idea that Garon and Haran end up with the same numerical value, which means you can kind of flip them back and forth. This is one of the ways that they play this math game. So Haran equals Garon, which means, and Garon is the Hebrew word for throat. So Jacob went out from Beersheba, went out from this place of wisdom and understanding to Haran, to the throat, or to Garon, to the throat, and took that thought and put it into speech. Everybody good and following? And then the verse says, he came to a place. Like, that was the beginning of the verse. He came to a place and slept there. So he came to a place, he came to, so as Cindy said before, Hamakom is actually a reference to God. In rabbinic texts, Hamakom means the place, literally, but it's used as a term for God, as in God is in every place. So in English, we will sometimes translate it as I did, as the omnipresent, as in God is in every place.
It's also the site of To Kill a Mockingbird, Macomb.
I haven't read that book in a long time. That's interesting. I'd have to see if that droshes itself out somehow. I think when I read it, I wasn't as in tune with it as I am now. But that's interesting. So he came to the Holy Blessing One, who is called the place of the world, Hamakom. So if you're coming to God, what are you doing? What would you do before God?
You would kneel and
Or you'd pray.
exclaim his name.
You're praying. Like, coming to God is like you're praying to God.
Oh, okay.
So what was Jacob doing? Jacob was coming to God and transitioning his thoughts into words. That's what's actually spiritually going on in this verse. Joshua, does that kind of help you explain that hint and what's going on now a little bit more?
I think so. I'm processing.
Okay.
So we're actually then not talking about action. We're talking about moving from thought to prayer. Is
I
that
think
what it's
so.
saying?
Yes, exactly. This verse has really little to nothing to do with Jacob making an actual physical trip from Beersheba to Haran. That's not at all. What's it talking about? It's talking about the spiritual journey that we all take, going from thought into action, or thought into speech.
But in speech in this context being prayer.
That's the way, yeah, that's where he goes with it, yes.
So
then what does it have to do with those 5 things that you break down? I mean, I guess it's about intentional prayer rather than just speaking the words.
So the five sounds, again, isn't about breaking, it's about how do you break the expansiveness of thought into these 5 channels of sound to be able to manifest the vastness into something concrete, semi-concrete, because speech is really kind
Because God is vast, and when we pray, that's when we have to narrow it down.
I think more thought is vast, but we have to be able to express our thoughts before, in prayer, we have to express those thoughts before God in a verbal way. We can't just, it's not enough to think the thoughts, we actually have to verbally express it.
Verbally
There's a lot
praise
of things in rabbinic life where thinking is not sufficient. So even the recitation of the Shema and the Amidah, sometimes you'll hear people say, you know, we'll chant through the Kedusha together and then we'll continue silently. Well, there's a problem halachically, is that if you actually recite the Amidah silently, it's not halachically valid. You actually have to say the words. So that's usually, if you'll hear me do it, I'll say privately, because you're supposed to whisper it in a way that you can hear it, but not everybody else can hear it. But you actually have to verbally say the words to be able to, halachically, for it to be valid.
So meditation is not halachically legal.
What
not
I will
considered
say is
prayer.
not that meditation's not halachically legal. I think meditation is fine. And I think, and I actually don't think the Or HaMeir would have any objection to meditation or contemplation. I think what he's saying is that's not, you can't only do that. That a life of meditation and contemplation is insufficient ultimately. And this is kind of where I want to circle back to what we were talking about near the beginning. Is there's kind of this idea in Kabbalah and Hasidut where thought without action is kind of irrelevant. And I think that's kind of what Stuart was saying before, that, you know, quoting Martin Luther King, is it's really nice to have really important thoughts, but if you don't do anything, if you don't manifest those thoughts into action, then it kind of doesn't mean anything. And there's a lot of talk in halakha about action without thought, that if you do an action but you didn't intend to do the action, is it still valid? That the rabbis talk about at length, but where he's going is also that having the thought but not expressing it, not putting it into something, into the world, not putting it into something concrete, is also irrelevant. So that it's great to sit here and think deep thoughts, but if you're not going to actually express any of those thoughts, what good is that doing? Does that take away from your meditation? No. You can still meditate, but at some point you actually have to take what you're learning into meditation and manifest it into this world as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're not, what are you doing?
So, and is this a Hasidic concept, or is this a broader concept in Judaism?
Which one?
The fact that if you don't translate your thoughts into action, that it's meaningless.
Hard to tell you if it's Hasidic or if it's not Hasidic. I think on some level, the rabbis of the Talmud don't deal with this side of it that much, because you're dealing with something that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Right. So, like, how do you deal with a thought that's not put into action? Well, there's nothing to actually evaluate in that sense. But, you know, the actions that don't have the thought, there's something to evaluate. That's something we can actually deal with. So at some level, I think this is a little bit more of a Kabbalistic Hasidic concept, because it's dealing with something more ephemeral and saying, okay, we know what to do about the actions without thoughts, but what about the inverse? What about the thoughts that don't get put into action? And there are some Hasidic texts that deal with, if you have a negative thought or an inappropriate thought, what do you do with it? And they talk about, there's sections and ways in which you try to elevate and offer those as sacrifices, in a sense, as offerings to God, as a way of elevating them from something inappropriate to something holy. And that there's a way that you can transition those as well. Other questions, comments, thoughts, reactions?
I looked up that Zohar verse.
Yeah.
And I still don't
find it.
Yeah, I found it under is this, how do you say it, Safaria?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I other than mentioning that same little passage that they mentioned, I don't, I'm not that deep yet. I don't understand it.
That's okay. The Zohar, in some sense, is intentionally difficult because you're not supposed to understand it unless you're supposed to understand it.
Well, they did a good job.
So I think where Reb Zev Wolf teaches us something is, I think, on two levels. I think on one level, there's a part of this that is prayer related and does apply to our prayer life. Is, again, as I said before, when you're praying, you need to say the words for it to be a valid prayer. So what are those? There's a level at which, what are those things that we are praying for? What are those things that we are thinking about? What are those things that we need? We need to be able to transition that from thought into speech for us to actually be able to pray it to God. My wife and I have an old joke we've been saying for 20 years now. I'm like, oh, what was I going to say? I'm like, oh, I was going to tell you something. I can't remember. What was I going to tell you? I don't know. I'm not Miss Cleo. Right? Or I'm not in there. I don't know. Is the other one. I'm not in your head. I don't know. And in some sense, I think that's part of it too, is that God's not in your head. So if you want something, you're going to need to speak up and say it. And that's an important part of this transition. So it's not enough to just think about and let God worry about, what your thoughts. There's a part of it that if it's really important to you, you need to be able to verbalize it. And if you can verbalize it, then you can move forward with it.
So when you and your wife are in bed, about to go to sleep, are both of you just talking to get all your thoughts and prayers out? Or is there a little bit where you kind of keep it to yourself? That's kind of a joke, but not really.
No,
I'd say that's TMI. Just saying.
TMI.
I'll say, once we're in bed, we try to be in bed and try to, go to sleep. But there are times when we're like, oh, here's all the things I didn't get a chance to tell you today, and let me share it all. And we can just flow through all the things that we needed to be able to say. But I was also thinking that there's a great concept that at least I learned it from Hasidic, so I'll give it to that. In between ahava and yirah, love and fear, and we talk about love and fear in terms of God, and and I'm sure we'll learn this at some point, but there's this force. They're polar forces. Is that ahava is the force that kind of brings you together and wants to bring you in unity. Yirah, fear is one that drives you apart. And in some sense, you need both in a relationship. Because if you only have love, if you only have unity, then you lose your sense of self in the relationship and you lose that sense of identity of who you are. Yira, fear, allows you to maintain an identity, but if you only have yira, if you have too much fear in that relationship, then you don't have that connection with the other person either, and you're kind of just a lonely, independent being. There's kind of a balance between the two that you need to have. So yes, there are some things you need to keep to yourself. You don't need to say everything that comes out. But that communication at the same time also brings you closer together. Both in your personal relationships and in your relationship with God as well. We'll tackle that in more depth at a later teaching, I'm sure. I have to find which teaching it is, but we'll get there. Other thoughts, comments, questions? I'd kind of started to say, like, there's the prayer part. I think the other part of it we kind of talked about too is it's not just thought to speech, but thought to action. And so if you know, some thoughts you don't want to put into action, that's an okay thing. But if you have thoughts that need to be put into action to be able to manifest into this world, then withholding them is a problem as well. But how do you transition and break down the thought and put it through so that you can actually do it in this world? And it's an imperfect science because you're taking the abstract and trying to make it concrete. And that transition's not always perfect, which is why sometimes things go wrong. And what you think is the right thing, the action that you try to take, doesn't always work out the way you think it should or would. And so that's part of the breakdown between the vastness of thought and the limited notion of speech and action that's more narrow. Eddie, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think this points out the difficulty of our services that are mostly Hebrew, because, you know, for those of us who can at least pronounce the Hebrew, we don't know, very few people in that service know the meaning of what they're saying there. And I'm trying to learn some of that, but it's hard to translate that into action when you don't know what you're saying literally.
Yes, and there's a couple different things with it, with responses. One is there's only like 2 or 3. There's a very small number of blessings and things that we recite in the service that actually have to be recited in Hebrew. So if your Hebrew is really that bad, during the private parts, there's nothing wrong with reading the English and or even while we're singing together, to be like, sometimes read the English and see what it is we're saying and what that means, and think about, and then you can think about what that means to you and how you want to manifest it in your life. The second
That is what I do. That's what I do. So
yeah, I think the second part of it is it's also okay to not always say the words on the page, but to be able to think about what are the things that you really need to pray for. So can you know, when we're singing together, great, but are there times you might need to sit back and actually think about what are the things I need to pray for? And maybe instead of reciting the words on the page, you're whispering to yourself the things that you actually need to pray for.
You know, sitting in a class like this, sometimes it makes you feel like you wish you could live your life over again. I mean, if you had the understanding that we now have and could put that into action, 70 years ago, then wouldn't you have lived a much better life? And you probably feel the same way in that, you're very learned, you're very articulate, but I'm sure you can think of people from rabbinic school that you were intimidated by because they were that much more learned and that much more articulate. And so you could even say for yourself, maybe I wish I could have relived my life because with this new understanding, I would be a much better person.
Yes, I think there's plenty of rabbis that I look at and like, man, I want to be like them when I grow up.
Yeah.
Some of whom are younger than I am, but I still want to be like them when I grow up. But there's two things. I think one part is that you get to know me enough. I tend to think a lot in song and movie quotes. So the one that was like, I wish that I knew what I know now when I was younger. That was you were talking, I'm like, that's what was like playing in my head with that song. It's a good song, by the way. But I think the other part of it is, okay, yes, it would have been like on some level, yes, it would have been nice for us to know some of these things when we were younger. And we're still alive now and we can still do it now. So, some level we might not have been ready to hear it when we were younger or to learn it when we were younger, but on some level it's irrelevant. It is what it is, but what can we do now to move forward with what we have now? So we learned it now, great. How can we live the rest of our lives and incorporate this moving forward from here? Any other last thoughts, questions, comments? Well, kol hakavod, y'all. Thank you for learning together with us. Next week, we'll do this again. And then the week after, we'll keep going for a little bit. And then we might take one more break at the end, but we'll kind of see how things go. But thank you for learning together. Thanks for being together. And if I don't see you before then, Shabbat Shalom. And if I don't see you on Shabbat, then have a great week. And hope to see you by next class next week, if not before.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks,
Sure.
Rabbi.
Thank y'all. Take care. Shabbat Shalom. Be well.